I'm wondering if somebody would be willing to start us off with Luke chapter 22, verses 26 through 71, that first paragraph on your handout. Who might read that for us, pretty please? Thank you, Richard.
As morning came, the elders of the people, both chief priests and legal experts, came together, and Jesus was brought before their council. They said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." He answered, "If I tell you, you won't believe. And if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the human one will be seated on the right hand of the power of God." They all said, "Are you God's son then?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need further testimony? We heard it from his own lips."
Thank you. As a reminder, we are using the Common English Bible, which is also the version that we're using in church during Holy Week. I wrote about that in this week's weekly newsletter. I think it does a clearer job of expressing the story that we find familiar. But because it's a little different from the version or versions that we're most familiar with, sometimes even familiar things seem unfamiliar. I'm curious, what are the words or phrases or details, even in that first paragraph, that grab your attention this morning? The human one? Yeah, the human one. And in other translations, do you remember what it is? Son of man, son of man. Yeah, a really complicated title, Son of Man, the human one, that Jesus seems to use pretty openly for himself. You might remember in the book of the prophet Ezekiel, the term Son of Man is used a lot, and it seems to be a substitute for mortal one, which is to say, I'm the child of a human person, which is to say, I'm a human person. Daniel, the last part of Daniel begins to kind of, we can see, in the last part of Daniel is written in kind of a later period of Jewish history, closer to when Jesus was alive. And we can see that voice takes the title Son of Man and starts to expand it into this end of the world kind of sense. Jesus uses it in several gospel accounts to refer to himself. But to say the Son of Man is to say the human one. It means mortal. And it does catch our ear a little funny, and I wonder if I didn't read about this, but I wonder if the editors who prepared this translation chose the human one because it sounds a little jarring on our ear, the same way Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man would have sounded so jarring in that day. I don't know. I don't know enough about the theology of that, but anyway. What else do you notice in that first paragraph? But yeah, the human one is what the CEB uses. What else do you notice? Yes, thank you, Richard.
I'd just like to say about the human one, there was real difference between this sort of later Jewish concept of God and the concepts of God of their neighbors. The Greeks, their gods were titans. They were really huge, and they would step on you, and people hated and feared their gods in many other places. But for Jewish people, God was human-sized, and you could talk to him. You could talk to him face to face, maybe in a spiritual sense. And Son of Man or human one or whatever you want to translate it as could mean somebody who's just a regular dude, or it could mean a God or a divine being who looked like a human being. And so it was kind of a messianic title, and it's really nuanced. It depends on how you use it. But one thing that stands out with me also is that Jesus says he is seated on the right side of the power of God, not on the right side of God. So there's this kind of blending of God with us, the human one, and then God is also transcendent, and we can't even look on God's face. He doesn't even claim to be with God. He's on the side of God's power.
Okay.
So he's talking about a quality of God and not God themselves.
Thank you. What do you, let me ask you to think of this paragraph as being about Jesus and not about the authorities. If you're reading this trying to figure out something about Jesus, what does it or does it not say about Jesus? What does in the case that Luke is making for whom we know and believe Jesus to be, what are the issues that Luke draws out in this interrogation? Oh, up here, all the way up here. Thank you.
I thought it was interesting where he says, "You say that I am."
Yes. Yes, you say that I am. Yeah, kind of a demure sort of response. Yeah. What are the two issues that the crowd asks about? They ask about two different labels for Jesus. The first label they use at the end of, in the middle of verse 67 is, if you are the Christ, right? And then the second time they ask, in verse 70, they ask, are you God's son, or Son of God is the title that we use. Notice that in Luke's version, the accusation of blasphemy is missing. Like the word blasphemy is used in other gospel accounts. Luke kind of, for whatever reason, Luke kind of separates that out. It feels almost as if Luke just wants to say again what the authorities are denying, that Jesus is both Christ, Messiah, and also Son of God. Two related, of course, understandings of Jesus' Christological identity. But they come to the fore. It's almost as if we're beginning this interrogation, and Luke doesn't want to confuse the issue. He wants us to ask, do you recognize Jesus as Christ and Son of God, or do you not? And that, I think, will be a governing kind of distinction all the way through the text. Yeah. Let's push ahead in the interest of time. Who would read for us that next big paragraph, which is Luke 23, verses 1 through 12. Who might read that for us, please? Thank you. Jeffrey? Hold on just a second. Thank you.
The whole assembly got up and led Jesus to Pilate and began to accuse him. They said, "We have found this man misleading our people, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar and claiming that he is Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and crowds, "I find no legal basis of action against this man." But they objected strenuously, saying, "He agitates the people with his teachings throughout Judea, starting from Galilee and all the way here." Hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was from Herod's district, Pilate sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was very glad to see Jesus, for he had heard about Jesus and had wanted to see him for quite some time. He was hoping to see Jesus perform some sign. Herod questioned Jesus at length, but Jesus didn't respond to him. The chief priests and the legal experts were there, fiercely accusing Jesus. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt. Herod mocked him by dressing Jesus in elegant clothes and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod became friends with each other that day. Before this, they had been enemies.
Thank you. I want to return back to the point that was made earlier about Jesus' response. What kind of response is Jesus giving to those who accuse him? And what do you make of that? The "you say so," or "this is what you say," or "you say that I am," or silence? Why does the gospel tradition give us a Jesus who responds in that kind of enigmatic way, rather than saying yes or no or nothing? Trent? Or you might have another response to offer. That's okay. Hold on a second.
I was thinking that he was responding to questions that were not asked in earnest.
Yes.
So why should he give an earnest answer?
Yes. So when one of my children says, "Why did you give him a bigger piece of cake?" and my response is, "Because I love him more," the child knows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I love that.
Dad.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. So he's not willing to play their game. Yeah. Perhaps. Why else? let's keep thinking about it. Why else does the gospel tradition give us a Jesus whose responses are, you say that I am, or you have said so? Why not just say yes or no? What's at issue here? What happens if he says to Pilate, yes, I am a king? What happens to him? Yeah? They want to crucify him either way, right? So if he says to Pilate, I'm a king, Pilate goes, oh, you want to fight with Caesar, do you? Well, we know what happens to people who want to fight with Caesar. It's the cross for him, right? Yeah. What happens if he says no? No, I'm not. What happens if he says no? What happens to our reading of the text? Well, heck, he can't say no, right? Because then what do we do? I mean, then we say, well, Jesus said no, so maybe we should just give up on this. Maybe we misunderstood it. It's an interesting, and it's not just Luke. This is true of the gospel tradition. Partly there's fulfillment of prophecy, but like a sheep before its shears is silent, so he uttered not a word. Other gospel writers make a clearer connection of that. Luke, perhaps when he says Jesus is silent before Herod, perhaps he has that in mind, but he doesn't make it explicit. But the gospel tradition as a whole kind of navigates this weird space of wanting to show a Jesus who has authority and who is in control, and yet not wanting for the Romans, for Pilate to have a clear reason to kill him. The Pilate's response to the people is what? In verse 4. And I love the way the CEB puts it. I find no legal basis for action against this man. That sounds like a very technical thing to say, and the gospel tradition wants Pilate and the Roman Empire to have no reason to kill him so that it's somebody else's fault. And by somebody else, we mean the Jewish leaders and the Jewish authorities, right? And that's part of the gospel tradition that takes shape and comes out, right? If he said yes before Pilate and Pilate kills him, then we don't have that sort of hollowness in the pit of our stomach when we hear the story about the crucify him. We miss Palm Sunday, right? Which is to say, that part of the tradition is kept alive for other reasons than pure history. Yeah. Reflections about that or comments about that? Thoughts about that? Yeah? Can you hold on to that? Yeah, Dave?
So the thing that I think about when I hear that sort of argument is that Luke is writing from a little bit later, and the Christians, the Jesus movement, don't necessarily want the Romans to realize that they were insurrectionists from the beginning.
Yes.
So we want to distance ourselves from things that can get us in trouble with the Romans.
Yeah,
Still in charge.
partly that. Yeah, sure, absolutely. And also, the relationship between the followers of Jesus and those who call themselves Jews was not friendly even by the time this was written. Yeah. The thing that comes to mind is the shaping of history in that way, and it sticks in tenacious ways. There are maybe you're familiar with the tradition, but I grew up in the American South, and I grew up kind of with this cultural understanding that the Civil War was not about slavery. That wasn't, the secession wasn't about slavery. Like, that's just kind of the way descendants of slave owners want to talk about that. They want to talk about states' rights and independence and economics, but they don't want to talk about that. And that's so tenacious. It sticks. So much so that politicians and historians, amateur and otherwise, they find themselves saying things like, well, it wasn't really about slavery. Because we just don't know any better. The tradition has so been shaped by that. And I wonder how much the gospel tradition has been shaped by that sense of we don't want to tick Rome off, and it's a lot easier to point fingers at the people we're angry at, right? Yeah. Let me ask about Herod. Luke gives us Herod. I don't think anybody else gives us the bit about Herod. Why? What bit of the story does that further? Why would Luke dig into his bag of narrative tricks and give us the bit about Herod when none of the other gospel writers mentions it? Luke wants to give it to us. Why? What point does that serve in the telling of the story to have Pilate say, oh, you're a Galilean, well, then I'm going to send you to Herod, and then Herod sends him back? What purpose does that serve in the telling of the story? Elliot, let's wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I would say it justifies the infuriation of the Pharisees, they would look at, well, Pilate didn't do what we thought he was going to do. We paid him off, but he still didn't do it.
Yeah,
Whether, we didn't pay him off. But they wanted to hear that and be done with it. But I think it's because I think the story was shown that they were even infuriated even more.
Yeah, so the crowd is becoming more angry, more
I
frustrated.
mean, there's a setup. I mean, it says legal experts in the previous paragraph, and it was really a big setup, you can tell.
Yeah, thank you. What else does it do? What else does it do for us? What else does it do? What does it do for our perspective of Jesus' innocence or guilt as we read the story? Right, not just one Roman official, but even Herod, who is a weird kind of, I'm not even sure if it's fair to call him Jewish. He's converted to Judaism, but only ostensibly, or his father did, to make sort of the people happy. So he's ruling over the sort of the northern part of the region. Not just one, but two officials are saying that he has no charge against him, right? It just means it means the anger of the crowd is really the issue. Like, it's as if we really want to be really, really clear that he was not killed as a political prisoner or to be punished for political reasons, but it's a religious thing. That seems, I think that sounds clear. And also the weird bit about friendship. What do you make about the friendship that Herod and Pilate had been enemies before that day, but they were friends after that? What is that? I mean, be a preacher for a minute and imagine just preaching on that line. What do we pull out of the text to imagine these two characters? What sense are we supposed to have about their relationship formed in this way? Ray.
Well, it's kind of a good joke among rulers, isn't it? They dress this imposter, this controversial figure that the scribes and Pharisees are much exercised about, and their own little private joke is he's a nobody, but you know how these people are always making trouble for our government. Ha, ha, ha.
Uh-huh. Yeah, these people. Yeah, thank you. What else? Yeah, right here in the middle.
First, it just sounded like a lynching to me, like a hanging, like you would see in the Wild West or something, But it also, the fact that they became friends reminds me of the old saying that a common enemy will make enemies be friends.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I love the image of it. It feels like a lynching or hanging. I love that. And also the bit about enemies and friends. Isn't that interesting? And I wonder if there is I wonder if there is a point to be made that even in his death, Jesus is able to reconcile enemies. I don't know. I don't know if that's Luke. That seems so cheesy. I don't like cheesy. But I wonder. Given what Luke's going to say about the criminal number 2, remember me when you come into your kingdom, maybe Luke is that sappy and sentimental. I don't know. Yeah. Let's push ahead. Who would read for us, please? That next paragraph, who would read 13 through 25 for us? Pretty please. Elliot, since you're close to the microphone, would you be willing to read that for us? Thank you. 13 through 25.
Then Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people. He said to them, "You brought this man before me as one who was misleading the people. I've questioned him in your presence and found nothing in the man's conduct that provides a legal basis for the charges you have brought against him. Neither did Herod, because Herod returned him to us. He's done nothing that deserves death. Therefore I'll have him whipped, then let him go." But with one voice they shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison because of a riot that had occurred in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them again because he wanted to release Jesus. They kept shouting out, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time, Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done? I found no legal basis for the death penalty in this case. Therefore, I'll have him whipped, then let him go." But they were adamant, shouting their demand that Jesus be crucified. Their voices won out. Pilate issued his decision to grant the request. He released the one they asked for, who had been thrown into prison because of a riot and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will.
Thank you. What are the details or the phrases that seem interesting to you, that stick out to you? Thank you, Karen.
He can't find that he's done anything wrong, but just in case he's going to whip him anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, he hasn't done anything wrong, but we'll whip him. Which is perhaps at least a nod to Pilate's complicity or willingness to participate. I mean, clearly, Pilate is being moved by the demands of the people. Pilate's portrayed cowardly in this way. But yes, I'll whip him anyway. Yeah. What else do you notice? Thank you. Oh, somebody beat you to it.
The fact that both Pilate and Herod found nothing wrong with Jesus and no reason to really charge him, they keep throwing this back on the crowd. And I'm just wondering if this is the basis for all that centuries of animosity towards the Jews.
Sure.
I even remember as a kid, we grew up in about a half-Jewish neighborhood, some kid beating up a Jewish kid, screaming at him, "You killed my Lord."
Happens all the time.
A 12-year-old kid.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if this is the foundation for a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing because it didn't start here. This reflects that it's already happening, but it's written this way because it's true that stain is true, and it's also perpetuated by it. Absolutely, yes. And notice the insistence that Luke has that he tell the story this way. I mean, This is not a one-time thing. Luke really wants us to make sure that we know for the third time, Pilate said, "I find no basis for these charges." If nothing else, for us to acknowledge Luke's not just bias, but his motive, his clear and unabashed motive there. Yeah, absolutely. All the way in the back, and then up here to Trent.
Well, it goes along with what Jeffrey said when they said their voices won out. For the first time, I guess I was just thinking, what kind of leader was Pilate?
Mm-hmm.
If he kept on saying no, 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 but their voices won out, so he gave in.
Uh-huh.
You know?
Yes.
He wasn't
Yes.
very strong himself.
Mob justice. Yeah. And there's a sermon to be preached about that. Yeah. Both church leaders and also political leaders. Yeah, absolutely. Trent.
So I just don't understand the change in dynamic. I mean, so previously you had the religious leaders really afraid to take a firm stand for fear of what the people would do. And now, all of a sudden, on a dime, the people have turned, from Palm Sunday to crucify him. And I don't see how that happens in the story, really. I mean, do you? I don't know.
Yeah. I'll respond to that. Go to your left, and then go across to Ray.
Well, I think the big thing is the turning over the money changers tables. That infuriated the religious leaders because they lost their economic means.
Yes, and then let's go to Ray.
All it takes is 100 ringers to change the tone of the assembly.
Yeah. I think it is incongruous, and we experienced that on Palm Sunday, right? I mean, it's incongruous. But remember, Luke wants us to see pretty clearly what it means for Jesus to be king, right? He's coming in on a colt. It's this mock parade, not unlike that of what would have been reserved for the emperor or maybe the governor, right? And Jesus comes in, and these shouts of Hosanna are shouts of, "Come on, Jesus, beat him, take the throne, let's start a fight." That's kind of the shout. If there is a connection, I think, at least in terms of a narrative connection, an arc, it's that the same crowd's enthusiasm about Jesus being king, to which the leader said, "Jesus, tell them to be quiet." Remember, the leaders are comfortable with the status quo, the relationship they have with Rome. Rome's letting them be in charge of the people in a religious and to some extent a political way. And so the leaders don't want that to be upset. Jesus comes in and says, God has something else going on here. And the people get excited about that. It's the cries of the people, Hosanna in the highest, here comes the Son of David, that becomes the fodder for his arrest, at least to Pilate. And there is a disjointed nature in which the same crowd seems to be calling for Jesus' execution, but I wonder if they are. I wonder how much of this is purely religious leaders saying, Pilate, he's not paying taxes. He's telling people to keep their taxes to themselves and to start a rebellion. I'm not sure how much the crowd, historically speaking, had to do with it. Notice, again, that the absence in Luke's telling of the story, the absence of blasphemy, the absence of the religious bit. If you come to church on Good Friday, and I hope you will, when we will read John's version, keep your ear open for those moments when the leaders say to Pilate, this man has called himself the Son of God, the leader, and for which, in our custom, he deserves death. Pilate is then afraid. That's missing from Luke's telling. For Luke, this is not a religious issue. This is a political issue. The religious leaders might have been upset at the turning over of the temple tables, but as you say, Jim, not because of the religious symbolism of that, but because of the economic bit, right? And so that becomes a twist. Ultimately, Trent, I don't know exactly how to make that connection because, at least as we portray it, those who are saying Hosanna now say crucify him. But I think the answer is that the religious leaders from the very beginning and all the way through have wanted Jesus to keep his mouth shut because they wanted to be in charge. Yeah. Other responses to that or filling it out? Yes. All the way in the back? Let's start in the back. Thank you.
What stands out to me is when they yell, crucify him, crucify him. And honestly, when we reenact that in church, I can't say that part. I can't join in. And it makes me think when we are among people who are saying something or doing something that we don't agree with, do you stand up and do you say something about what you believe or do you not?
Yeah. Listen to the sermon today. You've hit the sermon. Suzanne's going to preach, and that's exactly where it is. Thank you. Yes?
I just have a question. Barbarus, and I'm probably saying his name wrong, said that he was thrown into prison because of a riot and for murder.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like they're wanting him released, so they're his supporters.
Yes.
So they're rioters and murderer supporters, and I just wondered who he is.
Yeah, well,
I don't know.
Yes, and I'll answer in a roundabout way. Notice that Luke twice says a riot and murder, a riot and murder. Like if you missed it the first time, let's be clear that the person they wanted was a rioter and a murderess. Barabbas, likely an insurrectionist. He did the thing that Jesus, at least as Luke's telling the story, Barabbas did the thing that Jesus is accused of. Jesus is, at least as the gospel account goes, his sense of God's reign wasn't going to be accomplished through military or physical might, but through another means. Barabbas, though, was one of the many rebels who said, let's attack this outpost and see if we can free some of the political prisoners that have been held there. And so he was actually an enemy of Rome. Pilate seems to recognize that, if anything, at least as the story is portrayed. Yeah. Let's push ahead and do the next paragraph. It's most of it is unique to Luke, so I want to give us a chance to hear it. Who would read for us, please, 26 through 31? Someone will. Thank you, Karen.
As they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene, who was coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. A huge crowd of people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned to the women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't cry for me. Rather, cry for yourselves and your children. The time will come when they will say, 'Happy are those who are unable to become pregnant, the wombs that never gave birth, and the breasts that never nursed a child.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' If they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
Thank you. If you don't remember this, it's probably because Luke's the only one who tells it, except for verse 26. Verse 26, Simon of Cyrene is familiar to the gospel accounts. But this encounter with the women of Jerusalem, which is enacted in the Stations of the Cross, which might be where you remember it. But what do you make of this? What is the point of Jesus saying to the daughters of Jerusalem, "Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves"? What does that add to the story? Ray?
when the crowd and the leaders want Barabbas, they've embraced the seed of their ultimate destruction by the Romans.
They've embraced the what of their destruction?
The seed.
The seed of their ultimate destruction. Thank you. Yes, thank you. What else? Why women? What's the big deal about the women? Richard.
One of the themes in the Gospel of Luke is that Jesus is a protector of women.
Mm-hmm.
Now he can no longer protect them, so he's going to give them kind of the last piece of wisdom that he can. And you know what Jesus was doing intentionally when he surrendered himself for crucifixion was that he was trying to avert a war. The war was coming. The Romans had taken people's land, and you know, if you think about it, the people that lived in Galilee, you know, in the Renaissance paintings, you have all these men with gray beards. They're scratching their chin while they listen to Jesus. But at that time, most people died by the time they were 30 because of a poor diet. They didn't have access to clean water. They worked themselves to the bone every day. And you were a man at 12, so you had to go out and start working. So these are really very young people following Jesus. And they're really hot-headed, too. I mean, James and John were the sons of thunder. So Jesus, I think, foresaw, and he even talks about it in some of the parables, we're not going to win a war with Rome. We're going to have to wait them out.
Okay.
And so that's what he's trying to get to the women. He said, you have to be willing to wait out the Romans. And like the guy said, there's the seeds for destruction later, and about 30 years later, they had the Jewish wars.
Thank you. I noticed that, it sounds apocalyptic in that way. One thing it does is it reminds us that there are some in the crowd who are not calling for his crucifixion. It's just an interesting, I don't know if Luke intended that way, but it lets us know that this is not a universal appeal. Also, notice that Jesus, even in this moment, or at least as Luke portrays it, that Jesus is flipping, as Luke so often does, a sign of curse to be a sign of blessing, and a sign of blessing to be a sign of curse. You know, it's a blessing to be able to have children, but Jesus says, no, blessed are the ones who have not been able to have children. We might interpret that through that really dark lens of just be glad that you don't have children to carry with you as you flee into the hills, borrowing from some other apocalyptic language that Jesus uses. But in this moment, you know, this Jesus is asking them to see what real blessedness looks like, and we see that. That's a sort of a quintessential Lucan construction. Jeffrey, up here in the front.
Isn't this similar to the Old Testament prophets who say your actions today, like Amos, are going to befall on you in the future? In other words, Jesus is saying, they will say the mountains fall on us. Hard times are coming because of what is happening today. But isn't that like all the Old Testament prophets?
Yeah, it's as simple as saying that if you do something bad today, something bad will happen to you tomorrow. I do think if there is a prophetic element, it's the prophets are the ones who remind us to care for the downtrodden and the oppressed. And Jesus is asking us, all of us, to recognize where blessings are among those who are least likely to be identified as the blessed ones. The quotation that's rendered for us in italics is a quotation from Hosea, where in kind of an act of renewal and repentance, God's people, all the people of God, sort of say, let the hills fall on us in that way, but as a sign of returning. Which is to say that in that, maybe in that prophetic tradition, the challenges, the calamities that befall us draw us back into God's presence, perhaps, yes. Let's read the end, because we don't want to miss the end. Who would read for us, please? Let's split it in half. Who would read for us, please? 32 through 46. Who would read that for us, please? Samantha will, and will somebody else at that table then pick up with 47 and read 47 through the end? Thank you, Jim. Samantha and Jim. Right here. Nope.
Sorry.
Thank you.
They also led 2 other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." They drew lots as a way of dividing up his clothing. The people were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he really is the Christ, sent from God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him, offering him sour wine and saying, "If you really are the King of the Jews, save yourself." Above his head was a notice of the formal charge against him. It read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to him. "Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock, when the sun stopped shining. Then the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle. Crying out in a loud voice, Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." After he said this, he breathed for the last time.
When the centurion saw what happened, he praised God, saying, "It's really true. This man was righteous." All the crowds who had come together to see this event returned to their homes, beating their chest after seeing what had happened. And everyone who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance observing these things. Now there was a man named Joseph who was a member of the council. He was a good and righteous man. He hadn't agreed with the plan and actions of the council. He was from the Jewish city of Arimathea and eagerly anticipated God's kingdom. When the man went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body, taking it down, he wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb carved out of the rock, in which no one had ever been buried. It was the preparation day for the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was quickly approaching. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph. They saw the tomb and how Jesus' body was laid in it. Then they went away and prepared fragrant spices and perfumed oils. They rested on the Sabbath, in keeping with the commandment.
Thank you. As we finish, here again this today in church, the Passion narrative, listen for Luke's peculiarities. Listen for how Luke talks about power, how the dispute between, or the accusations of the religious leaders are presented to Pilate. Here, how these odd details like the criminal who says, "Let me be with you in paradise," as well as the centurion who makes this statement. Listen to how all of that shapes the story and hold on to it. Then come back on Friday and hear how John tells the same story in a very different way, which is to say every time we encounter the story from a different perspective, it invites us to see new emphases. I hope it's been a good series. I've enjoyed it. Next week there is no adult forum because we have our Easter egg hunt, but we will start again on the second Sunday of Easter with a new series. Let's close our time today with the grace. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all evermore.